Hi, my name is Anita Nowak, and I'm the author of this book. Welcome to Season 11 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. Well, welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today, I am joined by the fabulous Krittika Sharma, who is the creative director and founder of Maajhi, a company that is designed to enhance death literacy through the lens of connection, compassion, and consciousness in order to empower people to die well. She's the former director of Death Over Dinner in India, the largest social campaign across the globe that inspired over 200,000 dinners. As a senior strategist and engagement manager, she was a core team member who conceived, built, and launched the first global end-of-life collective, a digital platform for caregivers, care seekers, and service providers. Krittika is passionate about ensuring that people have agency, dignity, information, and the right to die well and on their own terms with the grace that they deserve. Welcome to the show, Krittika.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
When I learned about your work, I thought, oh, I cannot wait to have you on my show. And then you spent some time in India and the time zones didn't work. I have been longing for this conversation literally for months because we had a pre-call too so that I could understand your work better. I just think what you do is so important and profound, and I hope it scales so that everybody develops this literacy that you refer to, death literacy. It's incredible. Before I start with some questions, I'm going to read something that I pulled off of your website, which I think is really helpful to sort of maybe begin our conversation. So you've worked in the design of well-being in multiple sectors for many years, but on your website, it says the interest and urgency to work in the end-of-life care space came after being profoundly impacted by a personal incident. That's why you're deeply passionate about bringing dignity and well-being into the world of end-of-life care and the larger ecosystem of health. So could you kindly tell us what that backstory was about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this was when I was a professional singer, textile designer, was not even remotely close to the kind of work that I'm doing today or the kind of interests that I guess they've just evolved. One of my loved ones fell very, very sick, and it happened to be my father. And it's always that call that you're always worried about that you're going to get at some random time, and it's going to feel unsettling, and somebody tells you that the person's not well or is in a critical condition. And I guess I happen to be one of those people. And we rushed, made it to, he was actually unwell in another city, so we got a flight, we sort of went there. And of course we had the whole medical sort of staff in the hospital, of course, taking care of him. And I think that while the medical and the technological sort of advancements were there, sort of keeping him safe, and of course making sure that he was going to recover from a sort of medical and health perspective. I think the emotional aspect of that sort of really lies with the family and the loved ones and the informal caregivers. And pretty much overnight, you have the tag of being a caregiver. Pretty much overnight, you're sort of worried about this role and this relationship that you have with this person that is now sort of in this tender space. And you're suddenly having to talk about very difficult subjects. You're having to sign very difficult documents, whether it is about what might happen in surgery or even talking about the situation itself. And in his case, it was a cardiac situation. And so I think that when I was sitting in the hospital with him, of course, like I mentioned, the medical, the technological sort of aspects really covered the recovery from a medical space, but I couldn't shake off that feeling that I just wasn't ready for this. And I think this was probably 11 years ago. And I think for me, just being in the space of design, designers are always working in the space of empathy or are trained to work in the space of empathy in that sense. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, I'm not somebody who practices in a hospital, but is there a role for me as a designer to think about how to use empathy and address something as big as loss? And I think from that point onwards, it sort of just became my space to explore, and it just became possibly a way to work through it for myself. And then I thought that if I was thinking this way, maybe there are other people who feel this way as well. And then it slowly sort of just became something that changed my life. And before I knew it, I applied for a master's to come to Canada. And while I was focusing on strategic foresight and innovation, I proceeded to do a thesis project in looking at the role of dignity in death and dying. And so spoke to a lot of doctors in Canada and in India. And then that thesis sort of grew and became, sort of kept building momentum and sort of moved into becoming what Maajhi is today. And that's the organization that you were talking about earlier.
So as you're doing this research, what did you learn that you think was really valuable in having you reflect on this process that we don't tend to talk much about in our culture anyways?
Mm-hmm. So I think, as cliched as it sounds, I think we all tend to think about life, but we all possibly don't like thinking about death. And I think at least in the culture that I've sort of grown up in, my family is fairly death positive because my father, was in the armed forces and retired from there. And so talking about death somewhere, started off as jokes and started off as, of course, a way to prepare, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen and you have an unpredictable sort of career path and your whole family is sort of following that with you and needs to be on board and support that in their own way. And so I feel like a lot of those conversations sort of happened at home for me, but I don't think I took it as seriously as I did till this conversation really, till this incident sort of happened. And I think that it's interesting to see that when you go into space of thinking about loss or talking about loss, um, many cultures believe that talking about it is bad because it brings something bad with it. And I really wanted to sort of explore that because the interesting thing is all of us that we know, including ourselves, including our loved ones, as difficult as it is to hear or talk about, we are all like death is a certainty. When we talk about life being uncertain, I think death actually has the quality of certainty, and we somehow don't seem to focus enough on the fact that it is something that's going to happen. Um, and because and I know that from a behavioral perspective, we often also see ourselves, our future selves, as a stranger. We're unable to imagine what it might be like in 15 years if we are incapable of taking care of ourselves or fall sick or grow old. It's very hard to imagine that because we haven't experienced it. So that act of preparing for it can sometimes feel very difficult and can feel so far that we tend to disengage, or maybe because of the fear of the unknown of what might happen, we tend to sort of maybe ignore it. And I think for me, that was really the fascinating thing, that it is one of the things that universally connects us. And when we talk about empathy and we talk about connection, death in some ways is that connecting piece for us in that story. And I think for me that sort of created curiosity to understand it more from, of course, the literature, but also from how people have used it in, let's say, art and poetry and creative expression, but also in terms of conversation and connection. Because the one beautiful thing that I've noticed when people talk about loss is that the language around talking about loss is thought about. It's sort of nurtured almost. It's careful. You're sort of careful with it in a sense. And I think people think a lot because it has to open you up to a certain level of vulnerability. And it also probably requires the person who's listening, and in your case, you're listening to me, but it's that exchange of listening and sharing that I think is beautiful. And that's how it sort of connects to the empathic side of us and our human nature.
So interesting, some of what you said, because if I think about my own life, my husband is from Georgia. My daughter's 7 now. And there was a period of about, I don't know, 6 or 8 months, maybe a year ago, where she would ask a lot of questions about death. Like it just seemed like it was a developmental milestone that she was hitting. And my husband like always wanted to quiet her down, like, don't talk about death, don't talk about death. And so it became like a little thing between us that we, in front of her dad, my husband, we don't talk about death because maybe there's some uh, wives' tales that you bring it on by talking about it, something that you alluded to. But my daughter was just curious about death, like what will happen when I die, and what if I die, then when will, and I didn't mind talking about it. But with her, I didn't mind because I didn't feel any superstition. But my parents both turned 80. And so that, I'm living, I guess, in the generation, the sandwich generation, right, where we're taking care of kids and soon we'll be taking care of our parents. And it's now salient for me when I read the newspaper or something, I come across something where you have to have the conversation about all sorts of things, from estate planning to where am I going to find the passwords and what are your wishes. And it still, to me, seems to be a difficult conversation to have, because it doesn't, you feel, to at least to broach it, it feels to me like you're planning for your parents to die, and you want to get organized because they're going to be off soon, that you're almost afraid to have that conversation because they're going to feel like, hey, don't rush me off so quickly, like I'm still here. So I suppose there's like you said, a dignified, graceful way to have this conversation. And I wonder, so I think your organization is intended, its mission is to help with that process, am I right?
Absolutely. And I think what you're sort of speaking about, it's just so many things to sort of talk about, right? One, where I think when kids get curious, they're sort of curious in a way that is, like you said, it's part of the development process. And possibly some of the questions they're asking are fairly innocent. It's not coming sort of loaded with, hurting someone or disrespecting someone. It's really about trying to figure out what is this new thing and what do I do with it in some way. Um, and I think that the sense making that children have around loss is actually fantastic, because the way they sort of navigate it is really, it's open and it's sort of pure, and it's not sort of there's no judgment behind it. Of course they will be dealing with emotions like fear or confusion, and in some cases, many times children find out about it because there is a loss, and that's usually how they find out. And it's really at that point where so many times children have either been dismissed or having that right conversation. It's such a beautiful, pivotal moment to have a conversation which could possibly lead to a healthy relationship with loss. So I'm really glad that you were able to sort of navigate that and have that conversation. I think regarding, when it comes to preparing for loss, I think my parents they were on the opposite side for me, where I kept saying, oh gosh, like we're talking about loss and it's so difficult. And I don't want to think about a time where you're not there. Um, but I think over time, the way that idea has sort of moved for me, and maybe on a bad day, you sort of take comfort in it, is to sort of think about planning for somebody's loss or planning for this inevitable moment is possibly a way to honor what somebody has actually had and lived by. They work, it's like saying like you work so hard all your life to buy a house, and it's all your savings that have gone into a house. Um, it almost feels like that is the culmination, right, of honoring how much effort has gone into the hard work or the spirit that it's taken to get there. And I think loss, not planning for loss, I feel is so detrimental. I know this more in the context of India, that there have been so many families that break because there's no will. And if there's no will, how do you understand what belongs to which person in the family. Businesses can fall apart because of that. Um, Families fall apart just because they don't know how to distribute wealth. Um, and it's very painful because you're already dealing with the loss of a loved one. And then on top of that, to deal with the fact that there is no will and there's no last wish, that almost feels like it's just adding more trauma to what you are already going through. Um, and I think that yes, we can't avoid loss, but I think we can plan for it so that it's not about taking the pain away, but it's possibly about giving it some dignity and possibly trying to use um, some kind of intelligence and support and empathy to that situation. And so I would think about it more as almost like a responsibility and also in a way to empower oneself. So writing a will empowers me to say what I want to do with what I have cultivated and accumulated in my life. Um, and I think many times when people think about wills, it's interesting because in a will we're talking more about property and we're talking about money and we're talking about things that may not feel that emotional, but I think there's also a very emotional side to will writing, and that's something that we're sort of trying to work on, um, where we're really trying to say that you don't always have to write a will because you have something like an asset. You might have emotional things that you might want to give to someone. You might have wisdom to give to people. Um, you might have a lot of intangible things that you want to exchange with people, which I don't think a will kind of covers it, but I think a beautiful conversation covers it. I think having an empathic conversation, which is connecting, um, which speaks more to the human side of that person, um, probably brings that out. But again, that's speculation.
It's fascinating what you're saying, because you're just talking about, if you buy a house, right? You spend a lot of time saving up for the house, and then you have the mortgage for 20, 25 years. It takes up a big piece of your life. And there's lots of planning and there's lots of, renovations and iterations on the house itself. And that is a metaphor for like planning for your end of life. I mean, I think also about getting married, all the planning that goes into it. You have wedding planners. And yet we don't really spend much time. We leave it to the people who are mourning to plan that. And I'm now seeing something interesting show up in my mind about what it means to actually craft and curate and help guide those who have lost someone to actually celebrate the passing in a way that you wanted or it could envision, right? I could imagine it being very empowering and creative.
Yeah. And I think there are lots of cultures that actually use it as a time for celebration. And of course, there are different circumstances. Someone's lived a full life versus somebody who might have died very young and unfortunately. But I remember there was a conversation I was having with a gentleman a couple of years ago, and he was telling me about how his father had planned everything to the T about not just the will, but he had saved up money and put it aside for his funeral. So he was bearing the cost of his funeral. He had also designed how he wanted his funeral to look like. And it was really sweet because he gave him 3 points on a piece of paper. And he said, here are the people I want you to invite for my funeral. Here are the people I don't want you to invite. Let them just find out in their own time. Um, and the third one was, please make sure you get X number of death certificates because you're going to need them at different places. So it was almost like he had left so much of that I think it becomes an opportunity to honor someone, and not keep second guessing. Have I done something right? Have I not done something? Is this something that my parent or my loved one or anyone would have wanted? I think the more I've sort of connected around loss and the more I read about it, I think that many times we associate death and loss with very dark, if I want to bucket it that way. But I think you can't really fully bucket emotions, but I know that it sort of comes with the loaded emotions of grief and anger and sadness. And you're sort of, uh, I think loss sort of it's synonymous with those types of emotions. But I also feel like there is a side of loss where there is so much beauty in gratitude. There's so much beauty um, it even sort of evokes humor sometimes. Like so many times people attach their sense of well-being by being humorous about it, by being light about it. And this has been seen in many studies in hospices and hospitals where people are dying, that appearance matters, the way they are treated and spoken to matters, but also humor plays a huge role and becomes a huge coping mechanism for the person who is passing away and possibly even for their caregivers. And I think with any conversation I've had about loss, I don't think there's been a time that I haven't laughed or haven't seen that other person laugh or smile, because you are talking about someone who's dear to you, and you are remembering them. You're talking about your wishes. You're talking about your life. You're not messy. Like, death actually makes you talk about your life more than we realize it does. And I think that's really beautiful. Yeah.
Well, thank you for shining a light on some of the beauty that can come from those conversations. Hey, I don't mean to interrupt a great conversation. I just want to draw attention to the fact that there are over 120 equally awesome conversations of my podcast and YouTube series on my channel. Please subscribe. The world needs more empathy, and you have a role to play. And I'm dying to ask you, no pun intended, about death over dinner. It's so interesting. Canada, 30 some million people, can fit them all in California, right? So Canada 10x is USA, and then you can 10x is India. 200,000 dinners. That's extraordinary. So tell us a little bit about this initiative.
So Death Over Dinner was started in 2013 by Michael Hebb and Angel Grant. And they're really the founders and sort of the thinking and the heart behind it. And it started in a sort of very humble way in the US, and then sort of just made its way all over the world. And it's it's a wonderful concept, because when we talk about death, we usually talk about it in a doctor's office. We talk about it with the lawyer. There's a sort of formality to it. And that sort of environment sometimes makes it very difficult to have a conversation and open up about loss. And they felt, and their idea, which I think is just so simple and brilliant, was really about how do you make it easier, and how do you make the environment such that you can talk about loss in a more sort of meaningful and sort of shareable way. And what's more forgiving than a dinner table where, and we're all used to it, all cultures, people sit together, they break bread, we eat together, we share stories about our day. And I think just bringing those two things together created this level of impact. And I think what's beautiful is that no table has the same conversation, but you're still taking away learnings where everyone is part of that human experience. Everyone has experiences about loss. And those who haven't fully experienced loss in terms of losing a loved one is possibly anticipating it. Or maybe is in a point in their time where, in their life, where they have seen many losses and they're probably waiting, they're waiting their turn in that sense. And so I think that these dinners, there's like a script for the kind of dinner. If you want to do a dinner, the website sort of helps you with that. And I think I sort of stepped into taking that role on for introducing the concept to India in 2018. And we did this across 7-8 cities. There were multiple dinners that we did. And so it was just wonderful to see the kinds of people who came to talk about loss. And I think it was just a really interesting, unique experience to facilitate conversations about loss. And I think it goes deeper than just talking about just death. You're talking about loss, and you're talking about kinds of losses. Sometimes you can open up about the fact that you've lost a pet. And, recently, like so many people have been talking about pet parents and how that grief can sometimes feel much bigger than losing a person that you weren't even sort of close to. Or sometimes people can talk about loss in terms of a job, or it can be so many kinds of losses. Even though you start with death, it then sort of opens up what the whole spectrum of loss. Sometimes what was really beautiful is that because we were talking about a subject that feels fairly taboo or difficult to speak about, it helps people open up about other kinds of difficult subjects, like talking about sexual orientation, or talking about problems in their culture, or talking about a religious concern that they have, or something about their own self growth, or something like depression. It was just incredible to see how one difficult subject, when it's dealt with a certain level of empathy and compassion, it kind of allows you to unlock and talk about so many other things. I think that that experience as a facilitator for me was it was really wonderful. It was also difficult, so I do want to sort of um, share that as well, because I think talking about loss or thinking about loss a lot, um, I think one also has to take care of their well-being, um, as much as you're sort of holding space for others. And I think that your work in empathy will probably also speak to that a lot, of how empathy is required in all directions when you're doing any kind of work like this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Including self-empathy. Absolutely, without a doubt. Wow. So, okay, let's talk now specifically about Maajhi. So, I think there's a little backstory to the name that I'd love to hear about, but also I'd love to do a little unpacking of three types of processes, or three, it's not so much products, but do you call them processes? Do you call them offerings? What do you call them?
Offerings would be,
offerings. Yeah. So the first is obituary to self, be remembered through your story. And then last dialogue, learn the language of loss through connection. And third is death meditation, experience death to live life better. So yeah, let's do this.
Sure. So Maajhi is basically everything that I want to give back, essentially, through this. And I think I feel very inspired to do it regularly, rather than wait till I achieve something, or till I'm of a certain age, or till I retire, to sort of think about what that part of my life looks like. Um, Maajhi means ferryman. And in many cultures, they believe that the ferryman takes the soul across. And this was really the brilliant idea that my father had, and he actually named the company. So yeah, so that's really how Maajhi was born in terms of the name. Um, I think the three offerings that are on the website, we're of course going to be revamping. We have a lot more offerings that we're working on right now. But essentially, the three that you mentioned, the first one's called Obituary to Self, and it's really about people telling their own story. I think you said that really well, that you sort of rely on somebody else to um, plan a lot of things about what happens once you die. And similarly, somebody else writes your obituary, that he was a wonderful father, or she was a kind, caring mother, or aunt, or sister, or whatever it is. So we sort of were looking at some of the obituaries, and we said, what if somebody is in charge of writing their own obituary, just like how you sort of um, write in some ways your destiny and your life. What about people actually writing their own obituaries, and what would that look like? And we thought about it for a while, and we said, okay, how do we socialize this? Because if I go up to somebody and say, can you write your obituary, again, there's that fear of, oh, I don't want to bring it on myself, or it sounds negative. So I think when we talk about anything to do with loss and death, the framing of how one approaches an offering is very important. So I think the question that we sort of came up with, and I think it was a fairly simple one, was how would somebody like to be remembered? And so that was the question we asked people, like, how would you like to be remembered? Can you write your obituary from that perspective? And we got about 25, 30 obituaries. And we had people who were as young as 7 who wrote their obituary, all the way up to people who were in their 90s. And it was just, it was a wonderful experience, because I think you hear the word obituary, you hear the word death, and you're just like, this is going to be really difficult. I don't know how I'm going to write it. But as these obituaries came in, it was an entire spectrum. There were people who just wrote 2 words, and that was, somebody wrote an obituary which just said she tried. And I think it was such a brilliant obituary because like it's making you laugh, and I'm sure it makes lots of people laugh and smile. And there was this sort of humorous element to some people who wrote the obituary, all the way up to people who'd written these very um, these obituaries of achievement, almost like, they lived this full life. They were able to give back. They were able to run this huge empire. They had this amazing family, or they want to be remembered by their friends and family as this person. Somebody actually wrote their obituary during, on a flight when there was turbulence. I think it's just incredible to see in what context people wrote these obituaries. And I think what came out from these obituaries was that as when people sent them to us, a lot of people actually wrote back saying, I haven't spent time sitting and thinking about what my life really is all about. And some of them actually wrote and said, after I wrote this obituary, I realized I work too much. I think I should work a little less. And I think I need to spend more time with my family. And I think I need to say sorry to someone that I haven't said sorry to in a long time. And I think that was the beauty, that most people were talking about what's happening in their life. It's not like I'm gone, I'm dead, I'm somewhere else, or wherever somebody wants to go, or wherever people think they go. And I think that was a wonderful offering, and I think we're trying to expand on that in the new sort of version of the offering. The second one is called Last Dialogue. There are a series of 21 questions that we have curated with behavior scientists, with therapists, with wisdom collectors, with design strategists, like just a lot of people, and palliative care physicians, to see what it feels like to have a conversation about loss, about love, and about life. And so they're absolutely free to download, but it's really about seeing how people can have conversations without necessarily immortalizing people or their loved ones, but really trying to humanize people that they've lost, people that they're about to lose, and also humanizing themselves, and sort of being real about that sort of conversation. So, and the collection of questions, it took a while to get there, but I think we're really happy with the culmination of those questions, because they've made, again, I think what talking about loss really makes you put a lot of perspective on life. And I think, again, we've had a lot of people come back and say, I need to call up this person and tell them I love them. I need to, I need to change something about my life, or I'm grateful about something, or, something that's happening in their current life is sort of affected by it. And the third one is the instill death meditation. I have trained to be a death meditation facilitator. And what that is really trying to understand, for myself, of course, because that self-work keeps happening, but it's really about helping people experience what might happen to them in the last 8 to 9 hours of their lives, as they're dying and going into death. And so it's a sort of immersive experience. It's a meditation that I sort of facilitate. And in that, again, it is really about helping people understand what happens to their bodies. So what happens physically, what happens emotionally, what happens mentally. And through the meditation, there are some sort of guided questions, and reflections to sort of do as the body is shutting down. What are some of the things that might be going on in somebody's mind? But it's also a way to sort of reflect on one's own sort of life journey. What has it meant? And I think one of the most beautiful questions, which of course can feel very difficult, aside from talking about who you want to say goodbye to, etc. I've seen so many people sort of, including myself, finding it difficult to talk about what you want to say thank you to your body for, what do you want to say sorry to your body for, something that we all take so much for granted in so many ways. And of course, the one question of who would you it's like, what kind of, who do you want to resolve conflicts with? Or what are some of the conflicts you want to resolve before you go, so that you have this sort of clear passage to sort of go, and to go light. those are very difficult for a lot of people to sort of walk through. And I think I've really appreciated um, seeing and holding space for people experiencing what loss could look like. I think what it does many times is that a lot of people are so fearful of having a conversation or what that experience might be like. I think it's wonderful to see when people come from the other side and say, it wasn't that scary, or now I feel like I can understand this and I think I know how to manage this a little better, or I know that now I need to go write a will, or it gives them some level of confidence and empowers them to take action on something. Um, and this reminds me of a time where um, I had actually done a death meditation for somebody who was in her last stage of cancer, and her doctor was finding it was not completely having a conversation with her, which was maybe touching upon some of the emotional aspects of loss. Um, and she sort of came to me and she said, can I do this? Because I feel like I'm really scared and I don't know what to expect. And we did the death meditation, and it was difficult. We had to reschedule a couple of times because she wasn't well, and but got her as comfortable as possible, and we did the death meditation. And she messaged me after the meditation and she said, I feel like I can prepare to go now. And it really stayed with me because, again, I think somewhere it answered that question for me, that I might not be a doctor and I might not be a nurse and I might not be someone who is part of the healthcare system talking about loss from that perspective. But I think there's such a huge role when we combine other disciplines with empathy to address something that possibly actually belongs in a community setting as well as a medical setting, which is why something like hospices and palliative care are so unique as models, because it's a multidisciplinary team and it's not just one person who's going to fix or deal with death. I think there's room for all of us to be a part of those conversations or make that difference.
I knew that having this conversation was going to connect with purposeful empathy, but now I see unpacking death literacy the way that you do, with so much reverence for the process and the person in the process. I really feel how your work is really on point with purposeful empathy. I'm just struck by that. And what's interesting, I don't know if you noticed or if anybody else has been listening or watching, I should say, but there have been a couple of times where my eyes have been darting and haven't been with you. And that's because I was pulling up on the back of my screen, my PhD, not my PhD, my book. The very, very, very last chapter is a concluding chapter, and at the end of each chapter there are 3 exercises. So the very last exercise of my book, I'm just going to share with you. Wasn't planning on doing this, but then when I realized we were talking about it, I'm like, oh, I should really look for this. So I haven't read this in a while, so let me just see if I can read it properly. The practice is write your own eulogy. On April 11th, 2015, the New York Times published a piece by David Brooks called The Moral Bucket List. Here are some excerpts. About once a month, I run across a person who radiates an inner light. A few years ago, I realized that I wanted to be a bit more like those people. It occurred to me that there were 2 sets of virtues: the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the skills you bring to the marketplace. The eulogy virtues are the ones that are talked about at your funeral. Whether you were kind, brave, honest, or faithful, we all know the eulogy virtues are more important than the resume ones, but our culture and our educational system spend more time teaching the skills and the strategies you need for career success than the qualities you need to radiate that sort of inner light. Quote, in the spirit of what Brooks wrote, draft a 500-word eulogy for yourself, or longer if you're so inclined. Please don't see this exercise as morbid. Instead, consider it as an opportunity to articulate your most cherished eulogy virtues. Once you're done, consider making changes in your day-to-day life to better align with those eulogy virtues. Create a list of at least 10 changes and make a commitment to start living in alignment with your moral bucket list.
Oh, wow.
Huh?
I've got
Oh,
goosebumps.
Oh,
But
that's your work. That's your work. You help people do that. It's incredible.
yeah, and it's so interesting you said that, because but when I was getting everyone else to write their obituaries, I was like, I thought, okay, I'm going to write one, and I kept thinking, oh, it's going to be easy to do, and then I think I procrastinated for what felt like a month, and I'm sure it was a month. And then when I wrote my obituary, I was it was hard. It was hard to sit there and say, okay, like, what would I say? But interestingly, every year I go back to my my obituary and I read it. And it's been a couple of years since I wrote it. I don't feel like I want to change anything. And
Mm.
not because of I think, like, exactly what you said. I feel like with your resume, there are things you're always sort of adding to it. And we'd actually asked people to go back to their obituaries and maybe look at it and see whether there was something that they want to update or change. It's a little bit like what you would write with your will, right? You have your will, and then you have this obituary to self that you might want to leave behind. And so many people, um, they just said, no, we don't. Like, there's just, and so many people even manifested what they've written in their obituaries. So it's amazing to see that maybe that is a slightly slower process. It's more reflective, but I think that's the one that stays, and that's probably what people remember you by, even at work, even if they have your resume. Like, they will think of how you made them feel, or they will think about your light or your spirit, or whatever one would want to call that. Yeah.
Oh, Kritika, I really hope people are listening and watching this podcast and video, because I think there's so much richness to take from it. I want to thank you so much. Last question, if you'll indulge. I love asking my podcast guests to share a time in their life when they were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for them.
Yeah, I know you'd asked me this, and I told you I was really spoiled for choice. I think the one um, that was sort of sitting in my mind throughout this conversation was that after a death over dinner, there was a person who sort of came up to me after the death over dinner, and she asked me if she could meet me for coffee the next day. And usually, when I'm in the city, if anyone has any follow up questions or something, I would sort of go and meet them, see if they were doing okay after that conversation, because it could oftentimes feel very cathartic. And then, you don't know what to do with it sometimes. So you're, you probably just want someone to sort of speak to. And she happened to be she's a therapist. And she met me the next day, and she sat opposite me and had, waiting to have coffee. And, you're so used to doing the, hey, how's it going? And none of that. She, like, literally came, sat next to me, and she just had her sip of coffee, and she said, so who's taking care of you? And I was just like, what? And she was like, who's taking care of you? Like, what happens to you after you finish these death over dinners? And I think I feel like I would ask that question. I'm so used to asking that question as a facilitator or as somebody who's in this space, that I think I was just taken aback by how this person who had met me for literally 2 hours the night before felt like she needed to have a cup of coffee to be like, please, I hope you're managing your well-being, and what does that look like? And um, I think I've met her only a couple of times in my life, but she has become one of my closest friends. And it's just, I think I was so, while it sounds, fun and funny, I think I was just very moved by someone seeing me in that situation. Um, I don't think I was necessarily looking like I was doing badly or any of that. But I think sometimes, and I think there's some people who come into your life who can see your caregiving, or they can see your empathy, and they're able to ask that question back to you. And I think in those moments I feel very overwhelmed, almost with a very deep sense of gratitude, but I also feel like there are times it almost feels uncomfortable, because you're just so used to doing that it's almost like catching you off guard, but in the nicest way possible. So I think that I think that that's really what came to my mind when I thought about an incident. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love that. I love asking this question because I never know what I'm going to hear. And it's a reminder every time I do these conversations that empathy is in our grasp. It's around us all the time. If only we just lean into it and kind of practice it a little more, we could change our relationships and heal the world. So Krittika, thank you so much for being a guest. We'll have
Thank
all
you.
your information in the show notes, including the website for Maajhi, and I hope many people will be in touch as a result. I think you might be on your calling. I think you might be on your calling.
I hope so. I don't want to change it, so I really hope it is. Yeah.
So thank you all for watching and listening. We will see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy. Please subscribe to my channel. Please consider buying a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Remember, the world needs more empathy, and you have a role to play.